We're going to go through what is the latest on plastic credit systems. It is a very dynamic field. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of changes. So this is just capturing a moment in time. And I would imagine that even just a few months from now, things will be different. So we're going to go through a section that's giving you what is the current state of plastic credit systems. We'll go through some best practices for standards and claims, and also review some of the standards that are out there today that are being used. Then we're going to look at how are companies working with these systems? What is the most common thing companies are doing? What claims are they using? And what systems are they working with? Then we're going to do a review of some select credit systems. We won't go through all of them, but we'll just go through some that I think are some of the most common. And then also a little bit of an update of the marketplaces and platforms that are both doing some matchmaking and connecting companies to projects. So we'll start off looking at the current state of things. From the beginning, in 2013, BB Rio developed a system in Brazil to help companies comply with their EPR obligations. And this was really the first time we saw the use of credits being used to support recycling. And it was a very basic system. There was not a standard. The credit system, there was a marketplace for companies to purchase the logistics credits. But for the waste pickers in Brazil, which are referred to as catadores, their remuneration largely remained from the sale of material. So there's been quite some time since the program was put in place. There is definitely some demonstrated benefit to the informal sector, but the impact in terms of really growing capacity within the system, having system scale changes, is very unclear. And there's not a lot reported on that to date. So we move forward in time today, and we have the new incarnation of plastic credits. So I'm calling plastic credits 2.0. It's a voluntary funding mechanism to improve the management and grow recycling of plastics with areas of emphasis. And that's really around growing the collection of plastics, especially low value and or mismanaged plastics. We want to grow infrastructure to sort, aggregate. And again, there's an emphasis on low value or mismanaged plastics. And there's an objective to grow infrastructure for recycling and improve waste management. And so that could include, improving both waste and recycling behavior. And lastly, when we say the term infrastructure, a first world view on that is all of the mechanics of recycling. It could be collection bins, it could be a MRF and optical sorting, all the way to reclamation systems. But when we're talking about emerging markets and in Southeast Asia, the infrastructure really is the informal sector. They do the collecting, they do the sorting, they do the aggregating. And I think sometimes that gets lost in what a vital role that is when we think about system level changes, because their ability to influence the system is extremely limited. So on the right, here's our vision. Here are all the places that need money. But where is the influence of the informal sector? It's really on that collection and perhaps a bit on the sorting side. So that leaves a lot of the system really unaddressed when we think about the current structure of credit systems. So how do plastic credits work? On the right is a very nice graphic from Climeco. So we'll just kind of go through the steps. Plastic credits are qualified by a third party against either a known standard or protocol. This really guides what projects are going to be creating additional impact on the areas of interest, and that could be collection, recycling, or better management of material beyond what would happen without the presence of that project. So that's very important, that element of additionality in a project. Once a project gets certified as eligible, they can begin collecting waste and tracking volumes. They have to report on those volumes. Those volumes that are considered additional can have credits issued against them. So there's been some variation on what a credit is equal to, but there is growing harmonization around a plastic credit equaling 1 metric ton of plastic collected. So One of the issues around here is really understanding the equivalency of the material that's collected versus the material in some cases that are going to be offset. So, in other words, if I am collecting a lot of film, but I'm offsetting claims against PET, is that really a plastic equivalency? So there's some issues that have come up in these systems around that because obviously not all plastic is created equal. Funds from the sale of credits are used by the project developers to help offset the cost of the project and ideally improve the system. However, many of these project developers are nonprofits. They don't have a lot of money. And when they really got started, there wasn't a lot of transparency about how any money was going to be used. And we'll talk about how that has changed. So you have these components around the certification standard, additionality are really critical foundations to the credibility of these systems. So that's the vision. That's how they work. Now, what is the reality today? The reality is that most plastic credits are being generated from projects that are removing plastic from the environment. So basically, cleanups. These projects are important, they're impactful, they're almost always additional, but it doesn't really align with what I think the intention and vision of plastic credits were. And much of this material is rarely suitable for recycling. And what best management is today is really sending it for co-processing. And co-processing is code for RDF to a cement kiln. So it's being used as a fuel substitute. There are other uses, sometimes in reprocessing, where it could be used in asphalt, cement, or some other applications, but it's not truly recycled. And there is a lot of ambiguity around that language of recycling, because in some cases, RDF is being considered recycling. So I think we have a bit of a challenge in that area. So credits are incredibly useful to compensate informal workers for collecting this material. And it has had a very profound impact, particularly during COVID. I was reviewing a number of examples of people who, because of COVID, were unemployed, and this was a big help, or it's additional income for people. So there is this economic benefit. And the other one, the credits are being used by the developers to offset their expenses with operating these projects. And that includes health and safety equipment, t-shirts, bags, things like that you see here, as well as the transportation costs. RDF, or if you're selling it to a co-processor, you typically have to pay some sort of tipping fee. So those are all the types of places where fees from credits are going. But as you might imagine, this type of model, the impact on addressing the foundational causes of mismanaged plastics or growing recycling are really very low. So we have this disconnect between the vision and the reality of plastic credits today. And why is that? And part of that is the immaturity of the waste and recycling systems in emerging markets and the severity of plastic mismanagement. That is a foundational challenge. I tried to emphasize that in the slide before. COVID has added a whole other set of challenges. And really, I think there's been a sense of urgency to address some of the needs of the informal sector during COVID. I touched on this before, but part of the disconnect is also related to this low influence of the informal sector on governments and people who are investing in improved solutions for collection. We don't have good connectivity between these parts of the system yet. There is this demand by organizations to cover their costs. They too have limited influence as nonprofits, or as people very well intentioned or new to this sector. They're just starting to really understand these systems and developing those relationships with local governments or funding agencies so they can grow these systems. Often recycling is not a strength, and understanding the recycling system is something that they're definitely on a learning curve about. We mentioned this before, but the quality of collected plastics is often highly mixed in terms of resins. It can have a lot of organics, it can have a lot of moisture. So it does not make it suitable for recycling. And that really drives it towards things like co-processing. And I think finally, just to touch on the culture of these organizations that are issuing plastic credits is incredibly well intentioned, addressing a critical issue. But these are bootstrapping startup nonprofits, and they are using plastic credits or certifications and claims as part of their business model. And these started before we really had standards or thought about what a plastic standard would look like. So we're sort of now at a point where we're starting to catch up to that, where people are going up the learning curve and start to have some alignment. So you've probably heard this throughout the presentation. I'm not going to belabor this, but there have been concerns expressed by many people, many others, on plastic credit systems because we need rigor around them to make them impactful. So some of these criticisms have been around the abundance of proprietary standards with variable requirements, an incredible proliferation of claims and certifications coming from the packaging industry. I'm very familiar with that, but it really dilutes the impact when you have too much diversity. There's been a lack of a global standard that covers all geographies to harmonize the definition of plastic credits and to promote the best practices for issuing them. We have suffered from a lack of transparency and independent validation of how projects are qualified and if they're additional and how we define additionality. Chain of custody, understanding where material comes from and where it ultimately goes is critically important. So we've lacked some transparency of that. This idea of independent validation is quite important, both on looking at material, how the system works, but also on the accounting methodology. And this is where that issue around the equivalency of the plastic collected to the plastic being offset has been a concern. I think how credits are managed is always of concern because we don't want anybody to double count anything. So the accounting around that is quite important. And I think, especially in emerging markets, the capacity building with the informal sector, focus on health and safety, well-being, developing skills is really critically important and needs to float up to the top of systems because, as we noted, the informal sector is so central to the infrastructure. So I think lastly, our plastics credit systems really set up and designed to address those foundational causes of mismanagement and growing recycling. I think that is a question that is still pending. As we think about all of that information, what is the role for plastic credit systems in Asia and in other emerging markets? So, what I don't believe they can do is really address the fundamental causes of plastic mismanagement and scale recycling systems. I don't think credit systems will accomplish that. They're simply not large enough, and there's not enough money in them, there's not enough connectivity between them to solve those problems. But what they can do is they are an immediate market-based incremental step to address locally mismanaged plastics, and I think to a lesser degree, start to support circular systems. They are likely to have a much bigger impact where systems are more organized and supply chains are more formalized. And I say that because we now have some credit systems in North America, and I can see the sort of impacts that they have the potential to have, and simply because some of those supply chains are more efficient. I do think they can drive investment into infrastructure, both human and otherwise, to address local waste and recycling system deficiencies. But I think a really important role is they can be a proving ground for more effective solutions. And that's where I think, given time, we're going to see these go there in terms of education, awareness building. How do we get more formal collection, so on and so forth. So the lesson we've learned from carbon credit systems is that they're incredibly useful. They engage business, they drive investment, they raise awareness, and they activate action on these issues. And they definitely have impact, but they do not result in systemic or transformational change. Because again, we need policy, we need a lot of political and market will for some of these transformational changes. And in some cases, that political and market will is working against us, as we have certainly seen in the carbon markets. And that's why I say I think we need to adjust our expectations for what plastic credit systems can do until we really see that shift in policy and market interest. So we are seeing things moving in the right direction. I think it's been very positive. And so here's how some of these concerns are being addressed. We see some alignment towards the Vera plastic standard, which is a global standard. So we've seen some of these organizations that are issuing credits moving towards that standard. We've also seen other credit systems aligning around what are considered the best practices for standards development, and that's ISEAL. And so I think we're starting to see some of that diversity in some of the marketplace start to align. They're in the new versions of standards, so we're already seeing the next generation of standard updates. The role and well-being of informal workers is included in the standards. It's a focal point within projects, and it's also been driving reporting. Clearly, the pressure on this aspect has, I think, raised the awareness within these project developers, and they're really talking more about it and trying to show that they're trying to adopt and implement best practices. From just reviewing what's going on, there's almost more emphasis on the social benefit of these programs than the environmental benefit. I thought that was interesting. There's a really notable increase in the transparency and third-party tracking of both qualification of projects and material tracking, and we're seeing quite a bit more financial reporting on where funds are going. We're not seeing necessarily focus on infrastructure investment, but we are seeing some systems where credits can directly be applied to infrastructure. So, plastic for change, you can adopt a collection center. You can buy credits that will build a collection center. So, there's, I think, again, the awareness of some of the issues that have floated up with from concerns. I see some of these programs starting to be very explicit in addressing them. There is harmonization or increasing harmonization around the meaning and use of plastic neutral claims and the offsetting approach. But there is a lot of work to be done, as you will see, as we get into some of the credit and claims areas. So today, most of these credits are for end-of-pipe solutions, and they face really significant challenges to drive more circular solutions. We need to see more investment in organizing and doing capacity building within the informal sector. We would hope that we would move systems beyond people having to pull plastic out of the water every day. So there needs to really be a focus on how we work within this sector. Continuous improvement and investment in infrastructure, lots of work there. And I think then this connection to government and influencers that really do have the means for more systemic solutions, we need to start to connect these activities and conversations. Let's talk a little bit about what is best practice for standards development for credit systems. So ISEAL is a nonprofit that really has focused solely on what are good standards, what is the best practice for developing standards. So they have a number of principles around which standard development occurs. That's really important because it adds a lot of credibility to the system. It adds a lot of key elements that you see on the left here. It drives traceability and verification, additionality, environmental, social safeguards, and supplemental. But the way that these things are defined is done through a collaborative process with stakeholders. The process is open to public review. So you're really getting a lot of input when you define these aspects of a credit standard. So two standards have been developed using ISEAL principles, the Vera standard, and then the Green Blues RMS standard. Here, we're defining what was the outcome of that process. Credible plastics credit systems really have to have third-party audit or validation process to track source, the amount of plastic waste that's being collected or recycled. You also have to track that credit. You want to have blockchain or some sort of chain of custody for that credit. We're seeing some apps that are coming up with that type of thing. The entities that issue, these are the developers that issue or trade credits, also have to be audited by an independent body. That's where we get into challenges. And that's quite frankly been some of the practice today to make sure that those offsets or the credits are going to be accurately accounted for. You need to demonstrate alignment with the standard, but you also have to demonstrate that additionality or that improvement to the waste or recovery system that's measured typically in the volume of material that you're collecting. And it has to be more material than was collected before your project was there. So that demonstration of additionality is critical. And then we have this environmental social safeguard. So this is where it gets a little soft because what this actually means is really challenging. You have to maximize the environmental and social benefits while minimizing the degree of any adverse impacts. What does it really mean? And I think this is where we have standards like social footprinting that really has put some rigor, or other standards that are focused on social issues that we have to refer to in these areas. And so I think these remain somewhat weak and ambivalent, but we do have standards. Credit should be considered supplemental support for when companies and brands lack viable actions for reducing their footprint. It should not be the first move for them. And they definitely should not be considered a replacement for those other activities. So that's best practices. We take best practice principles, apply them while we develop a standard, and then this is what has been produced for plastic credits. Now let's get into claims because this is the Wild West. It truly is. We'll just quickly go over a couple of things, but the list on the left is actually probably twice as long. I tried to limit it to just the ones that are probably most relevant. There's a new standard out by the Ocean Bound Plastic Certification Org that is around OBP. And ocean bound plastic under their program is defined as plastic at risk of ending up in the ocean. And they say that that plastic includes a small fraction of commercially recyclable plastic waste and a lot of non-commercially recyclable plastic waste. So they actually go into a description of that, which is pretty helpful. But I wanted to talk about plastic neutral because that is the claim that is most widely used. And it can be applied at many levels, at a company level, a brand level, a product level, and an event level. So we're already getting into a lot of complexity here. Plastic neutral is achieved by baselining the scope of a plastic footprint at those different levels. You have to define what it is and the character of it, like what types of plastic make up that plastic footprint. And then you offset that plastic footprint through credits or plastic offsets that represent kilograms of plastic waste collected or recycled against that footprint. So that's where we started with these programs, was plastic neutrality. I think it's worth noting that to do this, plastic exchange requires a 3-year commitment for all levels except for the event level. But now we're in next gen claims, which is plastic negative. And what does that mean? We have a couple of programs that offer plastic negative certification. This requires a brand, and I think this can happen again at different levels, but you must offset plastic waste equivalent to twice the amount of plastic waste produced by the brand in a year. So it's a 2x factor. However, again, PCX requires a 3-year commitment. So in other words, it's more than just your footprint, it's a couple of footprints. We have plastic positive. It really refers to taking a positive step to address your footprint. And it's more for individuals, for a person who wants to contribute to ocean cleanup. You get a certification. It has to be above a minimum threshold. You can purchase it as a gift for somebody. It just shows you're taking action. Plastic Collective also does something comparable to this. The OBP, Plastic Producer Standard requirement for using their OBP positive claim, is similar to plastic negative, but now we've used a different adjective. It's positive. So you're collecting more than your annual footprint. And I'm not that familiar with this one, but it's in here. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to mention the recycled content one because this is from Green Blue's RMS system. It's very focused on recycled content and reclamation. And what they have is a label that allows you to use 2 certification labels. One is a recycled content label, and one is supporting investments in recycling. And I'm going to bring this up later because I think this is a really important point about what is the connectivity between plastic credits today and the goals of companies. when they're looking for recycled or recyclable. So let's get to the standards that are out there. And this is just a selection of the primary ones. And I tried to use the claims that are most common with them. I wanted to just have some common criteria to be able to look at the differences across standards. As I noted, Vera followed the ICL best practices for its development. It does not allow claims. It does require additionality. It requires third-party audit of organizations purchasing claims. It requires both parties to be registered in a registry, and it has safeguards for responsible sourcing. I think that is pretty much best practice right there. It's not that it can't be improved. And I think we're going to see the next generation of standards or an update to the standards that address some of these other things. So PCX has their own standard. They do have a series of claims, and those claims can be at a number of levels. This version of the standard requires additionality. It requires third-party audit. You have to be registered with them, and they do have safeguards. So I would say this is a step below, but they've removed themselves from self-certification as much because they have introduced that third party. The RMS standard, it's quite different. It's focused on just North America, but it followed ICL. Doesn't allow plastic neutrality claims, but it does have these recycled content and supporting recycling systems labels, has additionality requirements, so on and so forth. So I won't go through all of these, but I think what we have is the Vera plastic waste reduction standard is best practice. It's global, it's harmonized across geographies. We have systems that are clearly picking up the principles of best practice, but they tend to still be quite oriented around the localities that they're focused on. And the plastic claims are foundational to their business models. That's quite different than Vera as a standard maker. I just want to emphasize that I do think Vera is our best example out there. And it does address some of those criticisms that we've seen. It's globally applicable. It was developed through a really good process. It requires this third-party auditing, and additionality is very clearly spelled out in extensive ways. So it has rigor around areas where you think you might need it. And then areas like island nations or places that are very challenged, their additionality requirements are actually drawn out in such detail that you can get qualified through a number of different ways that I think are actually quite thoughtful in how they were put together. Because when I first read their additionality, I was like, well, what happens if there's no system in place at all? And so they've made some avenues or pathways for those types of projects. So this is just some of the specifics around Vera. So their waste type targeted is very broad: waste in the environment or waste for recycling. It's really open to any organization looking to develop a project that's to address mismanaged, uncollected waste, or in an area where there is a company that doesn't have a way to address waste in that market. So that is clearly markets of interest, emerging markets, Southeast Asia. They clearly state in their standard that companies should prioritize strategies that directly reduce and eliminate waste from their value chain and then consider credits. So they offer two types of credits. In both cases, 1 metric ton of plastic is equal to 1 credit. They offer a waste collection credit and a recycling credit. And those credits are really determined by the nature of the project. They have a registry that they operate, that a project that's issuing credits has to list them on that registry in an account. And then the person who might want to buy them has to undergo some verification process and also have an account in the registry. So it's a closed system, just not anybody can enter and purchase a credit. They do not support any specific claims. They do have some guidance documents on principles for best claims and some ideas of claims that could be used. I think that they have projects in Asia, Oceania now, and they have projects in the US in the pipeline that they told us about. Let's get into how are companies using these. Credits today are mostly being used for cleanups. I think that plastic credits are generally well aligned with corporate recycling goals, but it's challenging to achieve based on some of the markets that these are being issued from. I think the opportunity to use them to help promote some of their recycling objectives will be better when we have more projects related to recycling that are generating credits. But right now, those projects generally are generating what we would call those waste plastic credits, not the recycling plastic credits. There is just a structural issue with how credits can drive corporate goals. And part of that is that consumer product goods companies don't buy material, they buy packaging. And so in that supply chain, they have to have a converter who in turn buys material from a reclaimer to put into their packaging. So their market signal is not directly connected to that collection and sorting where we're seeing plastic credits being generated today. So we need to see, I think, basically more rational supply chains to help get that market signal through and have real influence. And the other thing is they have content goals. If I'm looking for recycled material, I'm looking for a content credit. A recycling credit is very broad, but it might not necessarily help me make a claim about my recycled content goal. So plastic credits are based on this valued attribute. And today, those attributes are really plastic waste collected, plastic waste recycled. But it can help recycling goals. But again, that supply chain disconnect is a little bit challenging to help drive goals. And they have very specific content goals, but the credits are not really aligned with that goals today. The RMS standard is well aligned with that desire to make those kind of content claims. So this is where I think when we see V2 of these standards, I think we might see some rethinking of some of these things because today I don't see them as being super powerful in terms of advancing corporate goals. I think there's work to do to achieve that. So, what do credit systems mean with EPR? And I think that the bullets we have here are really the ideal. They would advance more plastic waste is collected and more waste is responsibly disposed. This is why additionality is important. So we know it grows the system. It can drive investment. Those investments could improve the system. And then under the Vera plastic standard, regulators could allow producers to use credits as an alternative paying EPR fees as long as the funds go directly to projects that collect and recycle waste. These are some of Vera's point of view on how this could work. I think it needs to probably be more specific. I think there's a lot of ways they can go wrong and really stop greater activity on the part of companies to move the system forward. So if an EPR policy says producers can use credits, but it doesn't provide guidance or real specifics on expected outcomes, there won't be system improvements. And producers are not incentivized to do that kind of work. They're only going to purchase credits. So that's why what is written in policy is going to be super important. And especially if those policies that says you can do those credits and those credits allow RDF as a management, that could really be very challenging. So the EPR policies, they need to be sensitive to the local market realities. They need to recognize these are immature and inefficient supply chains, and they need to really carefully consider how credits can advance, rationalize those supply chains, build them out, build infrastructure. And that's a big piece of work right there. And it's not really policymakers who know the content to do that. It's going to be other stakeholders. Okay. So just in closing, I think Vera is playing a role of a harmonizing standard, both in terms of issues that are touching on and hopefully some of the principles of what good practice mean, especially around transparency and accountability. There's still a lot of work to be done in the claims world. Plastic neutral is the dominant claim. We don't see the current state of plastic credit strongly driving corporate plastic recycling or content goals. I think we have to figure out how we can connect them more closely. The capacity building, the standards are starting to address these issues, but there's a lot of work to be done to actually implement it and make things happen. So we're getting some of the rules in place, but then how does it actually play out in the field is work to be done. I think across the board, it was evident to me that we need investment in better systems, but progress is limited and the influence of the project developers and actors is very limited. And so I think that that is another place where we need to figure out how to tie things together so we can get that scaled impact. We do see some credits that are being tied directly to investments in capital infrastructure. This issue around co-processing, it is definitely a best practice, a best disposal practice, but I think it's something to really carefully watch because it would really undermine circular economy objectives if we can't figure out how to balance it with our recycling objectives. Putting plastic into durable goods, that's a foundation of recycling systems and especially good for mixed and highly variable plastic. So we need end markets. And these end markets may not align well with some brands' desire to have recycled content. So again, that's an area to work out. I think we have to recognize that just foundationally, right now, this world of credits and claims is foundational to operating budgets of a lot of these organizations are often nonprofits. They are not necessarily waste management or recycling experts. So I think there is work to be done here. And I think improvements working with these organizations to really drive the foothold they already have and really expanding the good work they're doing. But we do need to adjust our expectations for plastic credits, really until more significant project finances in this market. There's only so much these folks can do.